Hey guys, welcome to another video episode of our Stellar video series. In this episode, we are going to be talking about lumens, and the question is, what is lumens? Now, the first thing to say is that the name sounds very cool. Lumen is a very good name, is a very cool name, and I think the coolest symbol I've ever seen is this. It just makes sense. Okay, so back to what lumens is. So Lumen is the native currency of the blockchain. Let me write that out. The first thing to know is that Lumens is the native currency of of the Stellar network. Right. Looking at it this way, what is Lumens, right? This is the first thing we need to understand. Lumens is the native currency of the Stellar network. Yeah, that's that. And hey, so that's the first thing to note. Yes. And what do you mean by native currency, right? It's basically the token that is native to Stellar. So every blockchain tends to have its own currency. You've heard things like BTC, right? BTC is a currency of Bitcoin network. ETH is a currency of the Ethereum network. We tend to call it Ether or ETH, right? And for Lumens, also for Stellar as a blockchain, we have lumens as the currency of the Stellar blockchain. Right, so that's basically what it is. And then interesting thing about lumens is it functions in a lot of ways in the Stellar network itself. So there are a lot of things it does, like using it to pay for transactions, using it to pay for rent. We're still going to talk about what rent is, using it to talk about using it to pay for um network fees and transaction fees. Yeah, I've mentioned that already. Transaction fees for rent, use it to cover the balance for any kind of requirement on the network, any action you perform on the network. And so use it to also for smart contract transactions, right? Any transaction you perform, you use the lumens. So basically, what you need to know about the lumens is that it's a currency of the Stellar network, and it is the currency used across board in the Stellar network. Now let's go into details about what Lumens is. Let's talk about why do we need Lumens first, or why was Lumen first of all. So we know that the blockchain, Stellar in this case, the Stellar network itself is an open ledger, right? It's open to everybody. But because it is open to everybody, that makes it also vulnerable to spamming, because everybody wants to run something on the network. If it is open, everybody can access it, and then some people might want to spam the network. So in that case now, because it is a universal system, it is an open system, it is digitally available for everybody, we could decide to use a currency, right? We could use the currency to, like, okay, strip down the transaction fees, right? That is performed on for every transaction you perform on the network. We could require that, okay, we use this particular fee for transaction. We have this currency that we use to pay for that transaction that you want to execute. But in this case now, we can't go for a native currency, a traditional native currency. We could, Stellar could decide to do that, but then to allow for openness, right, and to allow for um this not to be restricted to, like, economical factors and political factors, right? To allow it to be open to everybody, and to ensure that it does not just affect a particular currency, like a particular currency is not fixed. Basically, what it means is, if you decide to use a currency, let's say for instance the US dollars now as the fixed currency for the Stellar blockchain, on the Stellar blockchain, the currency for USD will remain fixed, right? Why every other currency will probably fluctuate when there are different, probably a congestion on the network, or there are different things that allow for the gas price to fluctuate. So in that case now, to allow that not to happen, Stellar settled for a currency, right, that allows it to be able to perform transactions that is not any of the other currencies that exist. So you can transact with other currencies on Stellar, yeah, because it allows for native transactions of other currencies. But then you have a separate currency called Lumen that you can use to transact on the network also. So because of all of these conditions, because all of these constraints, so Stellar went with this cool currency name called Lumens. And then Lumens is typically the native currency of the network. So you use Lumen across the network for different things, and we're going to be talking about that also in detail. So that is why we have Lumens as currency. That is why Lumens was that's why Lumen is or Lumen exists in the Stellar network. Exactly. All right. So let's go to what we use lumens or why lumens is very important. So now looking at this, the first thing to understand or to look at from here is that when we talk about lumens, like we said, is the native currency of the blockchain. And use it to pay for transactions, like I've said, we use it to pay for rent. We are coming to rent, and we use it to cover for any form of um okay, yeah, you also use it for minimum balance fee, right? So we still coming to that also. So use it also for covering for balance of an account on Stellar. So these are things you need to note about Lumens, basically. The first thing to note is that Stellar requires a fee for every transaction you perform. So a fee is required for every transaction, right? We established that. And Lumens is that fee that you pay. So the second thing also is that smart contract transactions, um, of though they play different fee structure, yeah, but still they are paid with lumens, right? So we are still going to look at that also. So smart contract. So this is another thing you need to note about Lumen. So for every transaction you pay, for every transaction you perform, for rent. So basically, let me say for rent. So let me just shorten this to you pay for transaction fees. We can shorten this to what I've said earlier. You pay for transaction fee and pay for rent. And there's a third one that I would like to add to it. You use it to pay for. I didn't want to talk about this until we get to accounts, but we could say that you use it to pay for ensure okay, let's say cover for minimum balance of an account with a stellar account. So that is also what we use the domains for. So we'll come to Let's Stellar accounts eventually in the course of this series, and we see that for every account you have, it needs to have a minimum balance, right? So we use Lumen for all of these things. So I can probably remove this, right, and just stick to this three because basically does the same thing. So yeah, another thing we need to know is okay, I think this three basically covers everything. Pay for transaction fee, you pay for rent, and then you use the cover for the minimum balance on Stellar account. One another thing is that accounts, like I've said, needs to have a minimum balance. Now that we've talked about it, let's just keep it in on Stellar. You need to have a minimum balance for Stellar. So that's basically that. Now, looking at this now, we understand that we need to pay for transaction fee. And for every transaction that is performed, Lumen is used to pay for it. For every rent, right? For every rent, you also use Lumen to pay for that. And what do we mean by rent? We are going to talk about rent in detail. But now let's first look at this first. Let's talk about the account, right? Because we're already talking about accounts now. So now, why do we need to have account balance on Stellar? Now, they must always maintain. So it's more like a standard for Stellar, right? That every account needs to have a minimum balance, and the minimum balance required for every account on Stellar is equal to. Let me use this in terms of just mathematics. Is equal to two base reserves. Let me increase this to be on the same line. So it's equal to two base reserves. Now, what do you mean by base reserves? Now, let's talk about that also. So base reserves is the unit of measurement that is used to calculate an account minimum balance. So yeah, this is what we refer to as the base reserve. So for every balance, for every account, right, every account in Stellar, they need to have minimum balance of two base reserves, and a base reserve equal to 0.5 XLM, right? So that means if you need two base reserve for every account on seller, that means every account, therefore, every account on seller needs one XLM as the minimum balance. So by inference, we can infer this, right? Because we know that the minimum balance required for every account is equal to two base reserves. And a base reserve is just the unit of measurement that is used to calculate an account minimum balance. And one base reserve is equal to 0.5 XML. So that means two base reserves is equal to one XML. And therefore, one XML is the minimum balance required for all accounts on Stellar. Right. So good to just keep this in while we proceed on Lumens. Right. So now we're going to talk about so one thing to also note about the base reserve, right? Because before we proceed from base reserve is that base reserve can change. Now it has a fixed amount of 0.5 now, right? But it can change based on validator votes. I'm just adding this, I'm just keeping this in because this is fixed, yes, but this can also change, right? It is fixed for now, but it can also change. And one interesting thing about it is that it doesn't change frequently. Yeah, it doesn't change frequently. Also, these are good information to have about the base reserve. It doesn't change frequently. So it doesn't change frequently. It only happens once in a few years. Like it happens only once in few years. So those are informations to have about accounts, the base reserve, how it changes, because and it's based on validator code, like you said, right? So it's just based on okay, we vote to change this base reserve value, but it's like I said, it doesn't change frequently. It just happens once in a few years. So basically we can always assume that the base reserve for every account, or you can say the minimum balance for every account on Stellar is 1 XML. So that is a valid statement, right? So we already understand that the reason why we could say this is because we are talking about Lumens. We need to know that Lumens is what is responsible, is the fee, right, for all of this, is the currency for all of this. So this is XML, right, which is the Lumens. So for means every account needs to have a minimum balance of 1 lumen. I think that makes sense. So now, since we've talked about accounts, let me tag this as account. We can now talk about rent, right? Let's talk about rent also. So we've mentioned rents that we use Lumen to pay for rent, right? So I'm taking this bottom up like this. So we can say we can assume that okay, we use Lumen to pay for rent. And what is rent? Now we talked about smart contract the other time, and we say that smart contract does not receive for smart contracts, right? The applications deployed on the Stellar network. So smart contract does not require base reserve like accounts, right? That we have. So that's because they are smart contracts. So smart contracts don't require the minimum balance, just like a Stellar account does require. So that's the first thing to note. And because of that, every smart contract has to pay for rent instead. So because they are not accounts, they are not EOA accounts. Let me use the word EOA account. They are not the accounts on Stellar that needs to have base reserves, but they need to pay somehow for existing on the network, right? So how do they do that? The first thing they do is why is it blue? So the first thing about this is that you have the smart contract, right? Pay rent since they do not a minimum balance like an account does, right? So that's the first thing to note. So we are still coming to talk about why this is now. So we understand that smart contracts don't have a minimum balance. They don't have a base reserve, right? Like an account. So they need to pay rent. So now the rent is charged for every entry on the ledger. So This is how it goes. So for smart contracts, because they are deployed on the network, they live on the ledger, right? They live there, they exist on the ledger now. For every entry on the ledger, you need to pay rent for that. And for how long that entry or the contract exists on the ledger, you also need to pay rent. So basically, those two things are the reasons, those are the reasons why we need to pay rent. So because they are not accounts like the old base reserves, right? They need to pay rent for two reasons. So they pay rent for two reasons. So that's smart contract pay rent for two reasons. Pay rent for two reasons. So the first reason is that they need to pay for every entry on the ledger. Also, they need to pay for how long they exist on the ledger also. So you're paying for size, basically, and you're paying for duration. So those are the two reasons why we pay rent. That's the concept of rent, right? So that's the reason why rent is being paid. So rent is paid by smart contract to exist on the ledger, right? So basically, it's paid by smart contract. Let me add that to it. On the Stellar network. And then that's that. So another information that is needed at this point is that because we are paying for this, right, and we are paying for these two things, so there are different rent requirements based on the size and based on the duration. So some data will last for a longer time than some data, right? And so that also causes the amount of rent paid to vary. So those are things that we might still talk about in later side of later aspect of this series, right? But it's just good to understand that the payment for the space that is being used, right? That's for the rent that you pay for, also can vary. And it can vary based on the storage type that is being used on the blockchain. So the reason for this is if you are familiar with blockchain a bit or smart contract programming, you understand that there are different form of storage in when you deal with writing contract and um, executing contracts on the blockchain. So there are different type of storage. We have the persistent storage, we have the temporary storage, and the instant storage. So, but basically, just for the context of this, or just need to know that persistent storage is no longer than the temporary storage, right? And so that's basically the two we need to focus on right now. And those two, it simply means that for what if you are paying for permanent storage, you pay more, obviously, than temporary storage. So that is another factor that is needed to be known about rent. So yeah, basically that's like an introduction to Lumens, right? So let's talk about other information about Lumens. So Lumen has a supply metrics, right? Because it's a currency. Obviously, needs to have a supply. It was when it was created, there was obviously a supply by the Stellar Development Foundation, right? And that supply is what we want to look at right now. I want to look at the metrics beyond the supply. So basically, we would like to look at, not to go into a lot of details about all the information about these metrics, but we're just going to be talking about how it is being, the all the data that happened, all the information about what happened from the time of supply, right, and up to this point. So, but what I would like to point out about this is that the major information to know about the supply is that there are a total of 100 billion lumens, right? Let me just write that down. There are a total of 100 billion lumens. Just a moment, let me write this out. Yeah, so we have this, there's a total of 100 billion lumens. So let's talk about lumen supply matrix. Let's expand this a bit. So the essence of talking about this is not for like everybody, but for those that are interested in tracking the distribution of XML, XLM, and I'm just chipping this, but I'm going to like reduce the information, not talking about everything in detail, but just chipping some things. And yeah, so let's talk about the supply metrics. So I said the first thing you need to know about this is that um, the total supply of lumens, right? Let's write that out also. Total supply of lumens. Okay. Supply of lumens is equal to 100 billion. That is a very useful information because kind of like is very important for the course of whatever we are talking about now. So total supply of lumens, that's the first information to have about lumens, is that that's a supply of 1 billion lumens. Now you cannot mint new tokens, new lumens. Let me call it lumens. Now you cannot mint new lumens. All the lumens that will ever exist is equal to the 100 billion that we talked about. So 100 billion lumens will be the total number of lumens that will ever exist. So you cannot mint new lumens. 100 billion lumens is the total number of lumens that will ever exist. That's basically it. Cannot be recreated. But then let's take it let's talk a bit about the history of lumen and how and why we are not changing it and why it exists and all of those things. So let's take it trip down memory lane just a bit, talk about the history. So one interesting thing to know about lumens is that when it went live and the supply metrics was okay, the supply of the token was 100 billion lumens. Up until 2019, just a bit of a story about this. Up until 2019, the lumens increased annually, right? Increased annually by 1%. So, and it was a deliberate decision by the SDF at that point. So that was until 2019. That was until October. Yes, October 2019. Yes. So the lumen increased annually by 1%, and it was a deliberate decision by the SDF, that's the Stellar Development Foundation. But in October of 2019, right? Okay, so up until October, yes, the same October of 2019, the community voted against the annual increase of lumen because it was leading to inflation, right? It was causing inflation in the tokens, and that is not good for any blockchain, really. So you don't want to deal with inflations in the blockchain. Definitely don't want to, because so that the token can have more value, right? Definitely. So now the Stellar community voted against the inflation, which was basically the annual increment of the lumens. So after voting against that, in November of 2019, the overall lumen supply was reduced. And the reason why it was reduced was because there was already an inflation, like I said, inflation up to that point. By 2019, there was an inflation of more than 50 billion, 5 billion lumens already. There's already an inflation of 5 billion lumens because it increased by 1% every year. And it was released in 2015, right? It was released in 2015. So between 2015 and 2019, there was already an inflation of 5 billion lumens, right? And because of that, we know that this is not good for the blockchain. So the committee voted against it. And in November 2019, the total number of lumens in circulation was reduced. Total supply of lumens was reduced. It was cut short because now we already have 5 billion lumens, because since the inflation happened, we have 105 billion lumens now, right? Currently in circulation at that time. So, and because it was more than intended, it was reduced, it was slashed, and 55 billion lumens was burnt out of circulation. Like it was basically just sent to an address without the public key, without the private key, so it could not be retrieved anymore. So now removing 55 billion out of 5 billion lumens out of circulation, it means the Or the total number, the current total supply in circulation is now equal to 50 billion lumen. So this is, so in case you hear things like, oh, there was 100 billion lumen in circulation, now you understand how it came from 100 billion to 50 billion. There was inflation because of the annual increment, then it was reduced, it was voted against by the community. Yeah, so let me add that here. It was voted against by the community. And now 1% increment voted against by the community, by the stellar community. And in 2019, precisely, it was 55 billion lumens were burnt out of circulation, leaving just 50 billion lumen in circulation. Now, of the 50 billion lumen, 20 billion is what is available to use, and 30 billion from the 50 billion is used by the SDF for advancement of the protocol and for other use for the network, for the growth of the network, for the development of the network. So basically, that's the whole idea and the whole story about lumens, how they came to come, how it came from 100 billion lumens to 50 billion lumens, what it is, how it is a native currency, right, or for the stellar network, and you use it to pay for gas, use it to pay for transaction fee, basically normal transfers, and use it to hold, and every account must hold a normal value, a minimum value of 1 XLM, which basically means 2 base reserve, and then you use it to pay for rent for smart contract, which depend on the size and the duration and the storage size also, which is also important. So basically, this is all the information about lumens. I hope you've learned something about this. You understand what lumens are now. It's a very cool name. The XML and the lumens, they are very cool names. I think you won't forget that. And that is that for this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.